experience of older people in Northern Ireland.
Thank you, and I call Mervyn Storey to move the motion.
Move, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Business Committee has agreed to allow up to 1.5 hours for this debate. The proposer of the motion will have 10 minutes to propose and 10 minutes to wind. All other speakers will have 5 minutes. Please open the debate on the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for Justice for being in the House this morning. The inspirational contribution of older people living and working across Northern Ireland is something that we all as individuals and parties can unite around, whether it be via volunteering, caring, employment or childcare. The roles played by this constituent group are essential to the functioning of our society. As elected representatives, we therefore have a responsibility to give older people the confidence and capacity to live enjoyable, enriched and independent lives. But the first step, Mr. Speaker, must be to secure their safety in the community in which they live and in their homes. This will be even more crucial in the coming years as people continue to live longer. Currently, over 430,000 older people live in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland Statistic and Research Agency project that by 2041, almost 1 in 4 people living in the UK will be over 65. And of course, some of us are heading towards that particular age group, so therefore maybe we should have declared an interest before speaking in the House this morning. That is why we need dedicated action to place the needs of older people at the heart of crime prevention and crime response in Northern Ireland. It is about future-proofing our crime strategy to protect the most vulnerable. The Office of National Statistics report that almost 50% of over 75s live with a disability, whilst the Department of Communities estimate that around 15% of people aged over 65 in Northern Ireland live in relative poverty. And while today's motion deals primarily with a law and order response to crime against older people, a cross-departmental approach is needed to address the underlying risks to our ageing population in the future, and that is to really follow on from some of the comments that were made in this House last night, when there was a concern by members that there can be sometimes an overemphasis on the criminal justice element. But I think that you cannot be exclusive. It has to be a case of a combination of both and not a case of either or. But we want to focus around how we can bring about that cross-departmental approach. And I think in doing that, Mr. Speaker, it means us facing up to stark realities of the crimes that are being committed against older people today. Crime against older people, when we start to look at the figures released by the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and I declare an interest as a member of the Northern Ireland Policing Board, they highlight that in the year 2018 to 19, 6% of crime victims were aged over 65. There were 14 victims aged over 65 per 1,000 of the population, and 80% of crimes recorded against older people related to theft and criminal damage. 16% related to violence against the person. No one can begin to imagine the horrendous outcome that there are for our older people when they are attacked in such a vicious and such a cowardly way. There are gaps in relation to dealing with this particular issue. Taken at face value, these figures may not seem that high, but the interpretation loses sight of several key factors. First, the rate of crime against older people in Northern Ireland has remained consistent in the past decade, despite a reduction in traditional forms of crime. Secondly, outcome rates for crime against older persons lag roughly 2% behind those of crimes against other age groups. This is despite evidence that specific crime rate targets for the elderly, which are not currently used, have led to a narrowing this gap in previous years. Thirdly, local fraud and cybercrime statistics reported by Action Fraud, the National Fraud and Cyber Crime Reporting Centre, are not broken down by age of complainant. There is therefore a significant gap in the analysis of the threat posed to older people by this form of crime. And fourthly, Mr. Speaker, the devil may well be in the detail that is not available. Underreporting, a lack of dedicated provision for support for vulnerable older people in collecting evidence, barriers to witness testimony and other pressures caused by the criminal justice system. Turning to the Commissioner for Older People recommendations, Mr. Speaker, ultimately these are themes that are reflected clearly in the 24 crime and justice recommendations set out in the Commissioner for Older People's report on the experience of older people in May 2019. These recommendations range from the reintroduction of specific crime rate targets and a review of existing court infrastructure to the creation of specific older people policy guidance for those working within the PPS and CPS. We in this House and the Minister for Justice should have no hesitation in endorsing them in full and, I trust, without delay. But in closing, Mr. Speaker, I want to say that this would only be the first step. Yes, I give way.
It's interesting when we get into this debate, especially about older people in our community and the difficulties they have. But there are tested and tried organisations out there, like say Good Morning West Belfast, Good Morning Calne, and others that provide an excellent service, and many of them underfunded, an excellent service to ensure that older people within our communities that have some sort of contact on a daily basis, and maybe in tanning the whole crime thing that you're talking about, that's one of the ways that we need to look at and how we make life not only better but safer for older people. Would you agree?
And I thank the member, and I appreciate his long involvement in his own constituency in relation to knowing what are the needs of his constituents, and in a city setting where those particular needs are particularly more acute. I'm not saying that's exclusively the case, because obviously when you move into the rural areas you have other needs and other pressures and other issues. But I think that he's absolutely right, and that brings us back to the motive and the drive of the motion is about us collectively trying to see how we can ensure that we make life better for our older people. And I pay tribute to many of those organisations. I'll give way.
Thank the member for giving way. Would the member agree with me that when the statistics are recorded for a crime against an older person, indeed that the one or two people who may be involved and recorded as the statistic for that crime, but in fact where there are older persons living in a community, the tsunami wave of fear that runs across that community actually creates many more victims than those who have been directly involved in the criminal act?
And I thank my colleague for making that important intervention and observation. It's not just all about the individual, while that has to be at the centre of what we do. It is also about the sense of fear that then permeates the community. And again, it comes back to the comments by Mr McCann that there are many other organisations who are there to help, to support and to give advice and to give reassurance to our older people. And I think, Mr Speaker, that's why, in conclusion, we should be innovative and outward-looking in our approach to solutions. And in September 2018, the All-Parliamentary Group on Financial Crime and Scamming launched an inquiry into the impact of fraud and scams on vulnerable people. It recommended that the government build on the success of the projects like the call blocking pilot for people with dementia to address the vulnerability of older people to scammers. And this is just one example and it is in line with what has been said by my colleague, Mr McCann, that the examples of the type of initiative that we can have here in Northern Ireland, and those initiatives ought to be explored. Mr Speaker, in concluding, we should be ambitious and flexible in the protections that we afford to our older generation. Crime against older people is abhorrent, and those responsible should be held to account and put where they rightly belong, behind bars. This motion and the recommendations it endorses can help to give older victims the confidence, capacity and procedural support to make this possible. I therefore move the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, and I want to call Liz Kimmins, and as this is Liz Kimmins' first opportunity to speak as a private member, I would